Rain drifted softly over the marble stones of Arlington National Cemetery, each drop echoing like a memory that refused to fade. The rows of white markers stretched endlessly, a silent army standing guard over the fallen. At Grave 17B, a man in a worn military coat knelt, trembling. His name was Sergeant Daniel Cole, U.S. Army veteran. Husband, widower, survivor. He pressed a single rose into the wet ground beside his wife's name. His hand shook not from age, but from the kind of grief that never heals. "Hey, sir, you can't be here right now." The voice came from behind, sharp, impatient. Two police officers stood near the gate, one hand resting on a taser. The cemetery had closed 30 minutes ago, but Daniel hadn't moved. "She's all I have left," he whispered. "Please, just 5 more minutes." But compassion wasn't in their orders. The younger officer sighed, stepping closer. "Sir, stand up. Now." The tension hung thick as thunder. A few bystanders stopped to watch. Tourists, veterans, a young boy holding his father's hand. No one dared to speak. Daniel slowly rose, his boots sinking into the mud. His eyes, filled with loss, met the officers for a heartbeat that felt eternal. "You ever buried someone you love, son?" "Doesn't matter," the cop said. "Rules are rules." Then came the mistake. One movement too far. The taser snapped, electricity tearing through the rain-soaked air. Daniel fell back, gasping, his rose crushed beneath him. The cemetery echoed with the sharp crack of voltage and the crowd's horrified silence. And then, a step from the shadows of the path, a tomb guard emerged. Dress blues gleaming beneath the rain. White gloves, rifle at shoulder, face carved in stone. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of ceremony. But his eyes burned with something ancient. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The officers froze, startled by the authority that radiated from his stillness. The crowd began whispering. The boy gripped his father's hand tighter. The guard knelt beside Daniel, placing a steady hand on his shoulder, the silent gesture of one soldier to another. Then he stood between the fallen veteran and the police, the rifle's bayonet glinting faintly in the rain. And in that moment, honor met authority, and the world watched to see which would bow first. Long before that night of rain and flashing lights, Sergeant Daniel Cole had once stood tall beneath the blazing sun of Kandahar. He wasn't a broken man then. He was the kind who'd run back into fire to drag another soldier out. The kind who didn't believe in luck, only loyalty. But war changes more than faces. It changes what silence means. Daniel had lost his wife, Martha, not to war, but to the years that came after. Cancer, the slow battle no soldier can win. Every Sunday since her passing, he'd visited her grave, rain or shine, to tell her how the world had changed, and how he hadn't. That evening, the sky had promised storm, but Daniel came anyway, because grief doesn't wait for clear weather. A few yards away that night stood Staff Sergeant Michael Hayes, known simply as the Guard. To tourists, he was a symbol, a man in mirrored sunglasses and perfect formation, representing discipline itself. But behind that flawless uniform lived a man who understood loss as intimately as breath. Before he was a tomb guard, Hayes was Cole's junior in Afghanistan, a fresh recruit who'd followed Cole through smoke and chaos. Back then, Daniel had saved his life during an ambush outside Helmand province. Hayes never forgot that moment, or the way Cole had said, "If you make it home, promise me you'll guard what matters." Hayes had kept that promise. He joined the Old Guard, the elite regiment entrusted to guard the tomb of the unknown soldier, a post where every second is earned through silence and precision. For him, every measured step, every rifle turn, was a prayer for the fallen. But beneath that stoic perfection lay guilt, because Hayes had survived, and Cole had returned to a world that no longer had a place for him. That evening, Hayes had just completed his rotation. The rain had started, the tourists were clearing out, and the marble pathway gleamed like a mirror. As he removed his gloves, he noticed the commotion near the far end of the cemetery. The voices, the tension, the flash of yellow from the police vests. Something in him froze. He recognized that posture. The way Daniel knelt, shoulders squared even in sorrow. You could change uniforms, but you couldn't change a soldier's stance. He didn't hesitate. Hayes broke from routine, something tomb guards never did. His orders were sacred. Never speak, never interfere, never break the line. But that night wasn't about duty to a regulation. It was about duty to a promise that as he walked down the path, each step of his ceremonial shoes clicked in rhythm. Steady, unbroken, echoing through the rain. Every guard before him had walked the same ground, honoring those who could no longer stand. Now he walked it for one who still could, but had been knocked down unjustly. A small crowd had gathered, a mix of veterans, tourists, and a young reporter clutching her camera. Some whispered that the veteran was resisting. Others said the cops had gone too far. Hayes didn't care for sides. He cared for right. When he reached Daniel, the sight burned into him. His old mentor lying on the cold ground, hand clutching a crushed rose, the taser wires still trailing like cruel vines. Daniel's lips trembled as he looked up. "Mike?" For a heartbeat, the tomb guard's perfect composure cracked. His jaw tightened. The rain blurred the tears he'd never admit to. "You kept your promise?" Daniel whispered. Hayes gave a slow nod. No words, no salute. Just that silent understanding. The kind forged only on battlefields and funerals. To the watching crowd, it was an extraordinary sight. A tomb guard stepping off the ceremonial path, his uniform soaked but his stance unshaken. The police hesitated, unsure how to assert power over a man who was power embodied. "Step back, sir," one officer barked. "This is police business." Hayes didn't flinch. His voice, calm yet resonant, carried through the storm. "You've done enough." The younger cop, confused, lowered his taser slightly. Something in Hayes' tone, something disciplined yet unyielding, made him pause. The older officer shifted uncomfortably. "He was trespassing. You understand that?" Hayes' eyes locked on him, mirrored lenses reflecting the flicker of blue police lights and the rows of graves. "And you understand where you're standing?" he said softly. "This is sacred ground. You don't point weapons here." The silence that followed was heavier than thunder, behind the guard's stillness. His mind replayed every face of every brother in arms who never made it home. Every funeral he'd stood beside. Every folded flag. He remembered Daniel carrying him out of that crater years ago, whispering, "Don't let the world forget what honor looks like." And now here they were again. One man standing, one man fallen, both surrounded by the ghosts of those who'd done the same. The boy in the crowd whispered to his father, "Dad, is he a soldier too?" The father nodded slowly, eyes misting. "No, son. He's a tomb guard." That night, for the first time in years, Hayes broke every rule written in his training manual, but kept the one that mattered most. He guarded the living with the same reverence he gave to the dead. And in that rain-soaked silence, the legend of that moment began to take shape. The moment when a symbol of stillness became the voice of honor itself. Rain hammered down harder, drumming on marble and metal alike. The flashing red and blue lights painted the gravestones in unnatural colors, like ghosts caught between justice and shame. The younger officer took a cautious step forward, taser still trembling in his hand. "Sir, I said step back. This is an active scene." But the tomb guard didn't move. Not an inch. His uniform clung to his frame, soaked but immaculate, as if even the rain respected his discipline around them. The small crowd had grown, veterans, families with folded flags, tourists who had stopped in mid-tour. Some whispered, some recorded. All felt that something sacred was happening. The older officer, gray streaks under his cap, muttered under his breath, "This guy's from the ceremonial unit, right? The tomb?" The younger one nodded nervously. "Yeah, I think so. They're not supposed to talk, right? Then maybe he should remember that." The older snapped as he holstered his taser and walked forward, boots splashing through puddles. "Listen, soldier, you're out of line. This man was resisting. We followed protocol." The tomb guard's voice came low, measured like a command in formation. "Protocol ends where respect begins." The crowd murmured. The officer froze for half a beat. It wasn't loud, but the words carried more authority than any badge could. "You're interfering with law enforcement?" The older officer barked. Hayes' jaw flexed, but he stayed still. Behind him, Daniel Cole groaned, trying to rise, one hand pressed to his chest. Hayes reached down, steadying him silently. "He's not resisting," Hayes said evenly. "He's remembering." A few veterans in the crowd nodded in quiet agreement. One man in a wheelchair whispered, "Damn right." The reporter, soaked to the bone but determined, began filming openly now. "Can I get your name, officer? People deserve to know who fired on a veteran at a military cemetery." The younger cop's voice cracked. "Ma'am, you're not authorized to." But she didn't stop. The red light on her camera blinked like a pulse in the rain. The crowd began murmuring louder. The tension was no longer private. It was becoming public, visible, viral. The older officer turned, snapping, "Everyone back up. This area's restricted." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the onlookers. Someone yelled, "You tossed a veteran, man." Another shouted, "Show some respect." Even through the storm, the officers could feel the shift. The crowd was no longer neutral. The story had flipped. Hayes stood tall, motionless, facing the older officer. The rifle in his hand wasn't raised, but it didn't need to be. It was a symbol of duty, sacrifice, and the weight of every soldier who'd ever stood post. "Do you know what this ground means?" Hayes asked quietly. "Every inch of it is paid for in blood. You don't raise weapons here." The officer scoffed. "You're not in command here, soldier." Hayes' voice dropped, controlled, deliberate. "You're wrong. On this ground, command belongs to the fallen." The rain seemed to pause, as if listening. Even the air thickened, charged not by the storm but by the gravity of that sentence. Daniel, now sitting against the grave marker, looked up at Hayes, his old comrade, and managed a weak smile. "Still quoting field lines, huh?" he rasped. "Still breaking rules for honor." Hayes almost smiled, almost. "Guess I learned from you." He turned back to the officers. "You'll call an ambulance. Now." "He doesn't need," the younger officer began, and Hayes' tone sharpened. "You will call an ambulance." Something about the way he said it, calm, certain, but iron underneath, made even the defiant cop hesitate. The older one exhaled, frustrated, and gestured to his partner. "Fine, call it in." The younger cop fumbled for his radio. "Dispatch, need medical at Arlington, Section 17B. The crowd began to relax slightly, but not Hayes. He knew this wasn't over. Minutes passed like hours. The ambulance hadn't yet arrived, and the rain kept falling, washing away mud, but not the shame. Hayes stood in silent watch beside Daniel. Every breath felt like an inspection. Every motion was deliberate. Even now, he performed his duty, the guard who never turned his back, even on the living. Then, a command crackled over the police radio. "Unit 43, stand down. Command wants a report at the gate." The older officer cursed under his breath. He didn't like losing control of his own scene. But now there were cameras, witnesses, and a soldier who refused to bow. He glared at Hayes. "You think this uniform makes you untouchable?" Hayes' reply was a whisper. "No, it makes me responsible." Daniel coughed, weak but conscious. "Mike, let it go. It's not worth it." Hayes knelt beside him, voice steady. "Everything about this place is worth it." The boy in the crowd, the same one from before, tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad, why isn't he scared?" The father's eyes didn't leave Hayes. "Because some men aren't trained to back down. They're trained to stand guard." The older officer finally snapped. "You're obstructing an investigation." Hayes didn't move. "Then investigate," he said softly. "But you'll do it while respecting the fallen." "And if I don't?" Hayes took one slow step forward. The rain dripped from his visor like tears of steel. His voice remained calm, but his presence filled the air. "Then you'll answer not to me, but to every man buried here." The crowd gasped. The older officer took a step back unconsciously, his bravado dissolving in the face of something he couldn't intimidate. The siren finally wailed in the distance. Red lights cut through the mist. Paramedics hurried through the gate, rushing toward the scene. Hayes stepped aside just enough for them to reach Daniel. but his eyes never left the officer's point. One of the medics knelt beside Daniel. "Sir, can you hear me?" Daniel nodded faintly. "I'm fine. Just my chest." The medic checked his vitals, then frowned. "Heart strain. He needs rest, not shock." The word shock hung in the air like a curse. The reporter stepped closer. "Officer, care to comment for the record?" The older cop snapped. "No comment." The younger one kept silent, eyes down, guilt finally creeping across his face. Hayes turned toward him. "What's your name, son?" The young man hesitated. "Riley, sir." "Riley," Hayes said, voice soft but firm. "Someday you'll wear that badge with pride, if you remember what it's for. Protecting people like him." The young cop nodded slowly. The words landed. You could see it, the small fracture of conscience forming behind his eyes as the medics lifted Daniel onto the stretcher. The older cop barked again. "We'll be filing a report. You'll be hearing from our commander." Hayes gave a small nod. "So will yours." He turned toward the grave, Martha Cole's grave, and removed his white gloves. He pressed them gently to the headstone, then folded them back into his pocket. A symbolic act, breaking the ceremonial line, to remind everyone that behind the uniform was a man. The rain finally slowed, turning to a quiet drizzle. The crowd began to disperse, whispering words like hero, honor, discipline. The boy and his father lingered longest, watching the guard as he stood once more at attention beside the grave. The father whispered, "Remember this, son. The world changes, but honor doesn't." And in that moment, under the gray sky and the flag at half-mast, the confrontation wasn't between men anymore. It was between power and principle. And for once, principle didn't flinch. The ambulance lights still pulsed red against the wet marble, painting reflections across the gravestones like bleeding memories. The storm had softened, but the tension hadn't. Paramedics were preparing to move Sergeant Daniel Cole onto the stretcher when the older officer stepped forward again, jaw clenched. He couldn't stand it. The whispers, the cameras, the loss of control. "Hold up," he barked. "We're not done here." The medic frowned. "Sir, he's having cardiac stress. He'll answer questions before he leaves." Hayes turned his head slowly. "He'll go now," he said quietly, "or you'll be answering for this." The officer smirked. "And who's gonna make me?" "You." The words were meant to provoke. And they did, not with rage, but with stillness. Hayes didn't speak. He didn't blink. The kind of silence that followed was the kind soldiers learn on the battlefield. Not empty, but full of threat. "You think you scare me with your fancy uniform?" The officer snapped. "You're just a glorified mannequin guarding a tomb. This is real life." A murmur ran through the crowd. One of the veterans shook his head in disbelief. The boy clutched his father's hand tighter. Hayes exhaled slowly, one steady breath through the storm. "And this," he said, "is sacred life." The officer stepped closer, finger jabbing the guard's chest. "Back off, soldier. You don't command here." The impact made a faint sound. The tap of authority striking honor.it was the first physical line crossed. And everything after that slowed down. The younger cop, Riley, shifted nervously. "Sarge, maybe we should—" "Stay out of it," the older one barked. "He's obstructing. That's arrestable." He reached out again, open palm. Pushing Hayes' shoulder.it was a mistake he'd remember for the rest of his life. Because the tomb guard moved. Not in anger. Not in violence. But with the trained precision of centuries of discipline behind a single motion in less than a second. Hayes stepped back half a pace, pivoted his rifle across his chest. Not aimed, not threatening. But in the stance every soldier recognized instantly. On guard. The crowd gasped. The metallic click echoed through the cemetery like thunder beneath stone. Hayes' voice was calm, almost reverent. "You have just made contact with a sentinel of the tomb of the unknown soldier." Even the rain seemed to stop listening to itself. "And you have done so," he continued, "on hallowed ground." The officer's bravado cracked. What are you talking about?" Hayes took a single step forward. "Every man and woman buried here served something greater than themselves. This ground is not yours to police. It's theirs to rest upon." You threatening me, soldier? Hayes' voice didn't rise. No, sir. I'm reminding you where you stand. The younger officer slowly lowered his taser. The reporter's camera zoomed in, her hand trembling as she whispered, "Oh my God." The father in the crowd murmured, "That's not a threat. That's a lesson." Daniel, half conscious on the stretcher, stirred. His lips moved. "Mike, don't do it." Hayes knelt instantly, rifle balanced perfectly in his hand. "It's all right, brother. You just rest." Daniel looked up at him, rain streaking his face. "You don't have to fight for me anymore." Hayes' reply came barely above a whisper. "That's where you're wrong. You fought for me once. I stand for you now." The older cop, red-faced and trembling with embarrassment, turned toward the crowd. "All right, show's over. Everyone disperse before I start making arrests." No one moved. The veterans stayed. The families stayed. Even the reporter didn't flinch. The crowd had chosen its side. Not with words, but with silence. That silence was the crowd's verdict. Hayes slowly rose to full height. Rain glistened off his visor. The flag above the cemetery flapped once, hard, as if saluting the scene below. He took one ceremonial step toward the officer. Deliberate, controlled, and stopped just within speaking distance. Then softly, "You ever buried a soldier, officer?" The cop swallowed. "What's that got to do with everything?" Hayes pointed toward the endless rows of graves. Each one of them had rules too, but they broke them to save the man beside them. That's why they're here. That's why I'm here. The officer had no answer. His authority, loud seconds ago, now seemed small beneath the weight of that truth. The crowd was utterly still. No phones now, no whispers. Only rain and then, the gesture that changed everything. Hayes took his ceremonial rifle and drove its bayonet into the soft earth beside Daniel's wife's grave. The metal sinking cleanly into the mud, the rifle standing upright like a silent sentinel. He stepped back, heels together, spine straight, chin up. Assuming the final watch position, a murmur spread through the crowd. Veterans recognized it instantly. The eternal vigil at IT was the position a tomb guard takes when honoring a fallen comrade. What are you doing?" the officer stammered. Hayes didn't answer. His silence was the answer. The younger cop, shaken, whispered to his partner, "He's standing guard. For him." The old officer looked around. Faces, cameras, judgment, and suddenly realized how alone he was. Daniel's breathing steadied. He turned his head slightly to look at the rifle, then at Hayes. His eyes softened. "Always standing post, huh?" Hayes finally broke silence. Not loudly, just enough for Daniel to hear. "Until relieved, brother." The paramedics finished securing Daniel, one of them quietly wiping his eyes before saying, "We're ready to transport." The crowd instinctively stepped aside as they wheeled him out. The gurney moving down the path lined by white stones as Daniel passed the rifle. His hand brushed the sling. For a heartbeat, the two men's lives, one scarred by war, one forged by tradition, met again in that simple touch. When the ambulance doors shut and the siren faded into the night, Hayes remained, motionless, guarding both grave and honor. The officers didn't speak again. The older one muttered something into his radio, his voice small and tired. Then they left quietly, their boots echoing away into the rain. The crowd stayed for a long time after, unsure if leaving would somehow disrespect what they'd witnessed. A veteran in the back saluted. One by one, others followed, not to the flag, but to the man standing silently in the rain beside a rifle and a grave. The reporter finally lowered her camera, whispering to herself, This isn't a story. It's a moment." The boy tugged his father's sleeve again. "Dad, why did he do that?" His father knelt beside him, voice trembling. "Because some oaths don't end when the war does." And there, under a gray sky lit by the first pale light of dawn, a tomb guard broke centuries of silence. Not through words, but through stillness that spoke louder than any order ever could. That was the turning point, when the uniform became human, and the man inside it became legend. The ambulance disappeared into the mist, sirens fading, leaving Arlington Cemetery drenched in silence. But silence was no longer empty. It carried weight. Every step the officers took echoed like a confession in the marble corridors of the dead. The older officer, face flushed with humiliation, stormed toward his car. His partner, young Riley, followed quietly, head bowed. He avoided the gaze of the crowd, avoiding cameras, avoiding the truth that had just unfolded. The reporter finally raised her camera, capturing the retreating officers, the wet pavement reflecting their defeat. "This is unbelievable," she whispered, voice shaking. A tomb guard standing for a veteran, while law enforcement faltered. "It's going viral already." Within minutes, bystanders began sharing footage. Phones flashed with the silent confrontation, the pivot with the bayonet, the stillness that had broken a storm of arrogance. The phrase "honor over authority" trended before the sun had risen. Hayes remained at the grave, unmoving, hands clasped behind his back. His uniform was soaked, rain dripping from his helmet, but his stance was perfect, unbroken, unwavering. A small group of veterans approached, nodding respectfully. One muttered, "You didn't just guard the tomb today, you guarded a brother." Hayes nodded slightly. "We all stand for each other. Always." Inside the precinct, the older officer was already facing a storm of internal review. His superiors were furious, not just about protocol but public perception. The video had spread like wildfire. The stunned crowd, the silent authority, the veteran's helplessness, the young officer witnessing the lesson of a lifetime. The report was clear. The taser had been unnecessary, escalation avoidable, and disrespect for Arlington itself. A sacred violation. The officer was suspended pending investigation, a rare public rebuke that sent ripples through the department. Riley, the junior officer, was left alone with his conscience. Watching the viral footage over and over, he saw discipline, restraint, and honor in motion, things he had only read about in manuals. His mentor had been defeated by his own actions, while a tomb guard had demonstrated the authority of principle without firing a shot. Meanwhile, at the cemetery, Hayes performed a ritual gesture he never missed. Kneeling briefly, he pressed his white gloves against Martha Cole's grave, folding them neatly afterward. It was a small act, but to him it represented something greater than any confrontation. The triumph of human dignity over chaos. A young boy, the same who had clutched his father's hand during the standoff, whispered, "Is he a hero?" The father didn't answer at first. He simply nodded, letting the silence confirm it. "Yes, son, that's what a hero looks like." By mid-morning, news outlets and social media were flooded with clips of the event. Headlines read, "Tomb Guard saves veteran from police abuse," "Crowd stunned," "Discipline versus arrogance." "Arlington stand goes viral," "Silent soldier breaks storm of authority with stillness." Even commentators praised the restraint and courage of the guard. Viral discussions flooded platforms, some questioning the officer's judgment, others highlighting Hayes' calm authority. But the central message was clear. Honor and duty aren't just words, they are actions. For Daniel, it had been more than public vindication. Lying in the ambulance, he stared at the ceiling and whispered, "Mike, you were right. I'm still standing." "Because you were." The medics smiled quietly, shaking their heads at the understated heroism playing out in front of them. Back at the tomb, Hayes returned to his ceremonial post. He adjusted his gloves, checked the alignment of his rifle, and stepped into position. The bayonet gleamed faintly in the morning light, a silent tribute to the soldiers he had promised to protect. Living and dead, a veteran beside him nodded, murmuring, "Discipline beats chaos every time." Hayes remained still, reflecting briefly on the events. The abuse of power, the resilience of the crowd, the viral moment that would be remembered for years. He touched the dog tags around his neck, a reminder of comrades lost, promises kept, and the weight of every life entrusted to him. The storm had passed, but the lesson lingered, etched into the crowd, the officers, and the nation that in that stillness. Arlington became more than a cemetery. It became a testament to the fact that courage does not roar. Sometimes, it stands silently in the rain, unwavering, unbroken, and undeniable. The rain had finally stopped, leaving Arlington Cemetery glistening under the pale morning sun. Puddles reflected rows of white stones, each a silent story of sacrifice. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh beginnings, a strange mix that only those who've lost and remembered could truly understand. Daniel Cole sat on the edge of the grave he had tended for years, now supported by paramedics who had ensured he was physically stable. His gaze wandered over the rows of marble, but he wasn't seeing the stones. He was seeing the memories they carried. Comrades, friends, and now, a living symbol of what it meant to stand unwavering in the face of chaos. "You didn't have to do that," he whispered. From a few steps away, Staff Sergeant Michael Hayes approached, adjusting his wet gloves, every motion precise, controlled. His ceremonial uniform still gleamed despite the storm, the rifle now at his side in relaxed stance. "I did," Hayes said softly, "because you were right here, and no one should ever be alone in a place like this." Daniel reached out, his fingers brushing against the edge of Hayes' uniform in gratitude. It was a silent handshake between two men who had shared fire, loss, and unspoken promises. "You saved me more than once, Mike," Daniel murmured. Hayes gave a small nod, eyes scanning the horizon. "We save each other, Daniel. Always have, always will. That's what we swore to do, in battle and in life." The cemetery was slowly emptying. Families left quietly, veterans saluted, and reporters kept a respectful distance, capturing the final moments without intrusion. Yet a few lingered, sensing that the story wasn't just about a veteran or a tomb guard. It was about honor, restraint, and the quiet courage that refuses to bend. Hayes knelt briefly at Martha Cole's grave, placing his white gloves over the stone with care. He whispered a soft acknowledgement, a promise renewed. Every fallen soldier deserved the same reverence, and every living one deserved protection and respect. Daniel watched, emotions tugging at him. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small dog tag, one he had carried for decades, engraved with his own squadmates' names. He handed it to Hayes. "Keep it," he said, "for the times you need to remember why we stand." Hayes took it with quiet reverence, placing it inside his uniform jacket. It was a token of trust, respect, and a bond that transcended orders, laws, and even the passage of time. But a young boy, the one who had watched the entire confrontation with wide eyes, approached hesitantly. "Sir, are you a hero?" he asked. Hayes looked down at him, his eyes calm but piercing with depth. "No, son, I'm just a man who keeps his promise. The heroes are those who lived, those who fell, and those who remember them every day." The boy nodded slowly, taking in the weight of those words. His father patted him on the shoulder. "Remember this, son, courage isn't loud. Sometimes, it's just standing firm when the world tries to push you over." Daniel stood, leaning heavily on Hayes' shoulder as they walked slowly down the marble path. Every step was measured, a silent cadence of honor that mirrored the tomb guard's rhythm. "Do you ever get used to this?" Daniel asked, glancing around. Hayes shook his head. "Never. Every step, every ceremony, every moment at the tomb, it's all a reminder. We remember so the living can carry the weight without breaking." They reached the gate. Daniel paused, looking back at the rows of graves, the marble reflecting the first rays of the sun. "Thank you, Mike, for standing your post, even when it wasn't your order." Hayes nodded, returning to his position at the tomb. His figure straightened, every line of his body commanding presence, silent authority, and unyielding respect. The cemetery settled into a new calm. Arlington had witnessed a confrontation that could have ended in shame or violence, but instead, it became a lesson in restraint, courage, and honor. Stories would be told, videos would be shared, and hashtags would trend. But for Hayes and Daniel, it was simpler than that. A reaffirmation of the promises that define us, the bonds that never break, and the quiet courage that outlasts storms. As Daniel's eyes lingered on the tomb guard, a single thought crossed his mind. Some stand for the fallen, some stand for the living, and some stand for both. And there, under the clearing sky, the lesson of stillness, respect, and unwavering duty had been carved into memory. Unshakable, unbroken, and eternal. The rain had cleared, leaving Arlington Cemetery shining under the soft morning sun. The world had witnessed more than a confrontation between a grieving veteran and the authorities. It had witnessed honor in action, restraint under pressure, and courage that spoke louder than words. Some moments don't need applause. They are measured in stillness, in the weight of presence, in the unshakable discipline of a man who knows that some lines are never meant to be crossed. That was the lesson Staff Sergeant Michael Hayes imparted that day. Standing silently beside the grave of a loved one, facing arrogance and authority alike, he showed the world what it truly means to stand your post, for the fallen, for the living, and for every promise made along the way. Sergeant Daniel Cole, bruised but alive, understood it fully. In a world that often rewards noise and aggression, Hayes reminded everyone that strength is quiet and stillness is power. And for the young boy in the crowd, and for millions now seeing this moment online, it was a lesson in respect, integrity, and human decency that could not be measured in likes or views, but in hearts changed forever. Moments like these aren't just stories, they are reminders. Reminders that courage doesn't always roar, that heroes are sometimes silent, and that the right choice, even when inconvenient, leaves a mark far deeper than fear ever could. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that honor still exists in the world, share it. Let others witness the quiet bravery that defends dignity when it's under threat. Subscribe to our channel for more true inspired stories of courage, sacrifice, and moral triumph. And remember, in the face of chaos, tradition is not weakness, stillness is strength. Because sometimes the greatest battles are won not with weapons, but with principle.